Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome on this beautiful spring day. I'm Ruth Mandel, Director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Lewitt Lecture. I have the privilege of introducing our speaker, but first I want to tell you just a little bit about this series of lectures, the Lewitt Lectures. I think you've all got a copy of the program, and the program notes that the Albert Lewitt Endowed Lecture was established by Mrs. Benjamin Leon in memory of her brother. We've learned in recent years that Mr. Lewitt was a pharmacist, and he got into politics almost by accident. He was asked by a friend to manage his campaign on an assumption, and the assumption was that the local pharmacist must know everyone. Everyone needs pills. Everyone has a prescription. From there, he was hooked, and he ended up working on Capitol Hill in the 1940s for two senators. He introduced his family to the previously unfamiliar world of politics, and when he left a bequest to his sisters, Mrs. Leon established this lectureship as one way to share the same gift with others. Clearly, Lewitt's lessons stuck with at least one member of the family, his niece, Nancy Herman. She's an avid observer of politics and maintains a strong concern about promoting good government and good policy making. Nancy is invariably with us for these lectures, but actually today was unable to join us. And since we're going to be sharing, it's, as I don't have to tell you this week, it's the world of video recording. And since we will be sharing the video recording of John Lawrence's talk with her, I would like to say hello, Nancy, and thanks to you and your family for making these valuable programs possible. Never in the history of the Lewitt Lecture, and I've introduced a number of them, have we repeated a speaker. But today we alter that pattern because of someone who is so perfectly suited to the task that a second invitation was irresistible. John Lawrence spoke here in 2008, offering an insider's view of the Capitol from his perch as Chief of Staff to Speaker Nancy Pelosi. He was Pelosi's top staffer from 2005 until earlier this year, just a couple of months ago, through the periods when she was Democratic leader, then Speaker, and now Democratic leader again. In fact, John worked on high-level policy and political positions in the House since 1975, including as Democratic Staff Director of the Committee on Resources and Chief of Staff and Legislative Director to Congressman George Miller, a Democrat from California. He came to Washington with Congressman Miller. As Chief of Staff in the Speaker Democratic Leader's Office, John helped develop legislative policy and strategy with members of the House and Senate leadership and the White House, while he worked extensively on all kinds of major national legislation during both the Bush and Obama presidencies, including the TARP economic rescue, the stimulus bills of 2008 and 2009, and various energy initiatives. It's his work on health care, and specifically the Affordable Care Act, or what's regularly called Obamacare, that motivated us to invite him back. When John spoke to a group of my students last year who were privileged to take a trip to Washington on a class trip, he met them, and one student raised his hand and asked him to explain something about the Affordable Care Act, which he found very confusing. And John's brief explanation of the structure and implications of the legislation was, for me, a beacon of clarity at a time when nothing about the subject seemed too clear. Upon his retirement from the House, upon John's retirement from the House, Speaker John Boehner and Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi finally found bipartisan consensus, conferring on him the John W. McCormick Award for Excellence in recognition of his years of service. He's actually a native of Paterson, New Jersey. He holds a PhD in American history from the University of California, from Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College in Ohio. I'm delighted that he was willing to return to the Garden State and to the Eagleton podium yet again. Please join me in welcoming John Lawrence.
Thank you. Several years ago, I had the honor of speaking at the Eagleton Institute, as Ruth mentioned, and it's even a greater honor to be invited to come back. I guess I did okay the first time. I'd like to thank Ruth for inviting me and for everybody at the Eagleton Institute for a really interesting day of discussions of policy and political matters. I'm always happy to come back up to New Jersey, which, as Ruth mentioned, is my home state. Today, I've been asked to speak specifically about the development of the health care bill and the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. As the Chief of Staff to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, throughout this complicated and challenging effort, I'm delighted to discuss the history of that law, the benefits it is providing, and why I believe it must remain a permanent feature of our public policy. What I'm not going to do is to get into a detailed explanation of every nuance of the law and every provision of the law. That would take far more than the time that is allocated here. I'd rather talk a little bit about how we came to develop the law in the way we did. 3 years ago, last month, I attended a small reception in the Blue Room of the White House with the Democratic congressional leadership, as President Obama prepared to sign into law the premier achievement of his first term in office, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which is known as the ACA, or Obamacare. I reminded the President of our conversation nearly a year and a half earlier, when he had told me, I would rather have a health care law than a second term as President. Now you can have both, I predicted in the Blue Room as he began to walk over towards the signing ceremony. And we shook hands and he smiled very faintly at me and he said, well, we'll see. Well, delivering on the promise of health care reform was a tremendously significant and gratifying achievement. To stand on the House floor as Speaker Pelosi brought down the gavel, to see congressmen and congresswomen with tears running down their faces, asking colleagues to autograph their copies of the bill, was among the most memorable moments in my 38 years on Capitol Hill. And it was an historic moment. For nearly 100 years, the appropriateness of a government role in ensuring broad health care for Americans has been a persistent and divisive debate in this country. The path to enactment was littered with the failed dreams and shattered careers of generations of legislators. The discussion began a long time ago. I imagine it will come as an unpleasant shock to those who assert the government intervention in the provision of health insurance is socialistic or un-American, to learn that the Congress actually created a compulsory hospital insurance program for merchant seamen in 1798. A century later, as the social welfare movement raised concerns about public health and public contagion, some employers began offering health insurance to their employees. Ironically, the opponents of those early efforts to pass health insurance law included many labor leaders who feared that it would diminish the need for unions and leave workers vulnerable to losing these benefits when the political mood shifted and laws were weakened. Some labor leaders even expressed concern that health insurance mandates would discourage hiring of workers, a warning later adopted by the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable. Support for national health grew on a bipartisan basis during the Progressive era in the early 20th century. The influential Commission on Industrial Relations in 1917 recommended that we develop a program of health insurance, And the House Committee of Labor, which I was to serve as staff director 85 years later, held hearings on a health care proposal by Congressman Victor Berger from Wisconsin, who was, in fact, a genuine socialist. But the momentum slowed in the face of opposition from business, and physicians, and labor during the conservative domination of national politics in the 1920s, and focus on more immediate issues during the Depression of the 30s and World War II in the 1940s. When President Truman revived discussions of national health care early in the post-war era, a recurrent criticism emerged. Leaders of the American Medical Association castigated the Truman White House as followers of the Moscow party line. These accusations were not unprecedented. Healthcare historian Jonathan Oberlander has illustrated how critics have long associated national health proposals with foreign security threats. One critic labeled an early proposal a Prussian menace inconsistent with American values. And of course, during the recent battles, charges of socialism paralleled the accusations of socialized medicine that stigmatized Medicare debate in the 1960s. And so the initiatives on healthcare during the second half of the 20th century targeted specific subpopulations who were viewed as especially vulnerable, or to whom the government owed a special obligation. Senior citizens with the development of the Medicare program, low income and the disabled, the Medicaid program, veterans, children, the EPSDT and the SCHIP programs. Other sources contributed to the government's healthcare obligations as well. For example, 40% of the medical expenses resulting from worker exposure to occupational hazards are paid by government-funded programs like Medicare and Medicaid, a total of $27 billion every year. Even before President Obama proposed his health care insurance initiative, more than half of the United States population already received health care from one government program or another. Half. The substantial involvement of the government in these programs helped raise the concern about the impact of health care costs on the deficit. And yet, for all the hundreds of billions of dollars, public and private, being spent on health care, the cost benefits were very mixed. The United States still ranked near bottom of industrial nations on basic quality indicators, including life expectancy and infant mortality, although our per capita expenditures on health care were far above the average of these countries. Partly, those dismal results were because, unlike in other industrial nations, millions of Americans remained without health coverage due to employment status, pre-existing conditions, and the cost of insurance itself. Yet as cynicism towards government became widespread, fueled by Vietnam, Watergate, associated scandals, and incendiary political rhetoric, sympathy for federal initiatives like national health care diminished. Opponents capitalized on that skepticism to challenge plans for national health insurance. The infamous Harry and Louise commercials that were launched against the Clinton health care initiative in 1994 warned that government involvement in health care would mean a loss of personal choice and a diminution in quality of care. The Obama initiative of 2009 proceeded fully cognizant of this history of failure and well-orchestrated opposition. As the economy worsened, many urged the president to accept a smaller, cheaper alternative, something that might be easier to pass through a narrowly divided Congress, what my boss, Speaker Pelosi, ridiculed as the namby-pamby alternative. At one key meeting, President Obama quizzed his senior staff about whether they should even proceed with a comprehensive bill. Most advised retreat. But one senior staffer responded with a question. Well, Mr. President, you know what Clint Eastwood would say. Are you feeling lucky? Without missing a beat, the answer came back, hey, my name is Barack Hussein Obama. I'm the President of the United States. I'm sitting in the Oval Office. I feel lucky every day. A primary reason for the early emphasis on health care reform was the relationship of these medical costs to the projections for rapid increases in deficits. In fact, we often said that were there no issue whatsoever of inadequate coverage for millions of Americans, health care reform was just as essential in order to help reduce rising deficits over the course of the next 2 decades. Controlling health care costs does not mean constraining the availability or quality of care. As we've seen, high expenditures do not necessarily correlate positively with favorable outcomes. There is enormous fluctuation throughout the country for comparable treatment, sometimes in excess of 10-to-1 differences in the cost of the same procedure. Healthcare was projected to consume 20% of the gross domestic product by 2020, 1/6 increase above the 2010 level. The reasons are not terribly difficult to understand. Add 65 to 1945, and you get a whole lot of baby boomers turning Medicare eligible in 2010 and thereafter, many of them destined to defy the actuarial projections of longevity made at the time that Medicare was created. But more than budgetary concerns drove the pressure for health insurance law. Most Democrats in Congress had long believed that government has a moral obligation to ensure, especially in a country of enormous wealth and medical sophistication, that every person has access to affordable health care as a right, not a privilege. Some are uncomfortable talking about health care as a right. House Democrats were not. That policy also happened to make good sense economically because broad coverage meant a greater ability to control costs and expand preventative care that would reduce health spending. And that is why we fought to ensure that the ACA would extend coverage to 33 million people who did not have health insurance. By contrast, the 2009 Republican alternative included only 3 million new people, 1/10 the level of the ACA. But even among Democrats, universal or mandatory coverage was not fully accepted at the beginning of the debate. Remember that one of the distinct differences between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama during the 2008 primary season was Clinton's support for mandatory health insurance coverage for everyone. Obama came to accept the Clinton concept of a broad law encompassing mandatory coverage, but he never embraced the cornerstone of the liberal paradigm, a government-run, single-payer approach, much like that used in most countries overseas. Single-payer was viewed by many as the least complex, and the efficiency of the low-overhead Medicare model was frequently cited. But too often in our history, the ship of healthcare reform had foundered on single-payer shoals. The administration and congressional leaders were insistent that this time pragmatism would prevail. During the course of the debate, an alternative to single-payer developed, the public option, a government plan to compete with, but not replace, private insurance plans. Conservatives predictably rejected the public option as a variant of the single-payer approach and predicted that private companies would be unable to compete with a government program unobligated by advertising expenditures or seven-figure executive salaries. Healthcare providers like hospital and physician organizations strongly disliked the public option, fearing it would replicate the lower payments that they received from Medicare as compared to private insurance policies. And truth be told, they may well have been right. Insurance companies and providers might have earned less with an efficient public option. But for many liberals, President Obama's failure to fight aggressively for the public option undermined his credibility early in the effort to pass health insurance reform, and it may have dampened enthusiasm in the crucial 2010 election, when some of the Democratic base stayed home and the control of the House switched to the Republicans. But it is important to remember that Obama never embraced the public option any more than he did the single payer. Many who were prepared to jeopardize the entire reform effort over the public option had never even heard of it 6 months before it became a sacrosanct liberal totem. Yes, Obama could have fought harder for it, but it probably would not have made any difference at all. Successful politics, after all, requires that you deal with the world as it is, not as you would personally design it. That is the purview of columnists, editorial writers, and professional fetchers, and maybe some college professors. Insisting upon a single payer, or even a public option, would have doomed the bill by ensuring that the opposition of powerful groups like the AMA and the Hospital Association, groups with huge influence not only over Republicans who already opposed the legislation, but with many moderate to conservative Democrats whose support we needed to pass the legislation. There can be little doubt that if another Democratic administration foundered on health care, the issue would be considered politically radioactive for another generation or more, and by then, health costs would have escalated out of control. Instead, the president embraced a plan he thought might generate bipartisan support, a mandate requiring employers and individuals to purchase insurance, often with taxpayer subsidies, from private companies, a construct developed by the Conservative Heritage Foundation in 1989 as an alternative to a government-run program. This employer mandate was actually a centerpiece of the Republican alternative to the Clinton health care bill in 1993. As we all know, it was also a key feature of the Massachusetts universal health care law enacted under the governorship of Mitt Romney, who called the mandate essential for bringing health care costs down for everyone and getting everybody the health care insurance they deserve and need. His program has worked. Under the Romney Mandate program, Massachusetts has achieved nearly universal coverage, in part because the penalties for non-participation are more onerous than under the national law, which we subsequently enacted. The Obama administration made other concessions to the traditional opponents of healthcare, of universal health care, in order to avoid the minefields that had doomed earlier efforts. The administration negotiated a deal with the pharmaceutical industry, pharma, which had played a key role in the derailing of the Clinton initiative in 1994. Veterans of that experience, including Rahm Emanuel, now the president's chief of staff, were adamant about minimizing the lobby's destructive influence. They negotiated a truce in which the administration promised not to support reforms anathema to the pharmaceutical industry, such as allowing the reimportation of cheaper drugs or setting lower drug prices. In return, pharma not only agreed to support the law, but committed $80 million to an advertising campaign to generate public support for its passage. That's a long way from Harry and Louise's "they choose, we lose" refrain, although critics in the Congress felt that the administration should and could have demanded that the industry commit far more money to their effort. Hospital and physician organizations now came aboard as well, leaving the insurance industry as the major holdout. When the insurer Anthem announced an ill-timed sizable premium increase in California, that industry's credibility largely withered, and the prospects for the bill's passage improved measurably. President Obama, I think, had genuine, if naive, hopes of achieving a bipartisan health care initiative, as he did on many subjects early in his presidency. Republicans shared his concern about the long-term deficit, he believed, and key Republicans like Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa had participated in extensive negotiations over expansion of the S-chip program for at-risk children just the previous year. Those negotiations yielded a compromise that passed the Congress, but was vetoed by President Bush. In making these concessions, Obama may have hoped that his congressional detractors would be enticed into making the 2009 effort bipartisan as well. What he misunderstood was that even if he secured agreement from some key Republicans, like Grassley, the party's leaders usually could not deliver troops when needed. In fact, Senator Grassley was largely scorned by most Republicans for his long effort to develop that bipartisan S-chip expansion. And we could have used some Republicans. Notwithstanding the healthy Democratic margin in the House and a 60-vote margin in the Senate, enough to prevent filibusters, we by no means could count on our entire caucus to vote for the legislation. Speaker Pelosi and Senator Reid knew that the Affordable Care Act could only pass by the narrowest of margins if everything went right. And in Congress, everything rarely goes right. That fact of life necessitated months of meetings by Speaker Pelosi with dozens of individual members, state delegations, and many of our sub-caucuses in the Democratic Party, the Progressive Caucus, the Blue Dog Caucus, the New Democratic Caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, as well as the use of the reconciliation procedure to circumvent the Senate's obstructive filibuster rules. There's no question that Speaker Pelosi's extraordinary skills as a leader played the crucial role in securing passage of the law, both by keeping the White House committed to the comprehensive bill and by keeping her own caucus in line. Even when all of the concessions and the late-night negotiations were finished, a switch of just 3 votes in the House would have defeated the bill, which lost 13% of all House Democrats and gained the vote of only a single Republican. Now, this account may appear to give credence to the assertion that Obama, Pelosi, and Reid were at fault for excluding conservatives from key negotiations on the bill, compelling near-unanimous Democratic support in order to pass it. But as with so many allegations about this act, this version of history misstates the historical record substantially. In the House, 3 committees held hearings and markups on the bill during months of consideration. Dozens of Republican amendments were considered, and many were approved. Even the cornerstone of the law, the individual mandate, was a conservative construct. And yet Republicans announced their firm opposition to the legislation, just as they had to the economic stimulus legislation in January 2009, despite numerous efforts by the president and Democratic leaders to negotiate a compromise approach. In the Senate, negotiations dragged on for over a year, until it became evident Republican leadership was maneuvering not for improvement, but in hopes of killing the bill, especially following the death of Senator Kennedy in the summer of 2009. In fact, had conservative Republicans spent as much time engaged in good faith negotiations as they did in egging on demonstrators from the Capitol balconies and at town hall meetings, they would have had considerable influence in the design of the law, as did conservative Democrats. So why did Republicans respond so negatively? As this account indicates, it could not have been because of an inability to participate in the process, or because the bill did not incorporate key provisions they themselves had originated. I would suggest 2 major explanations. First, a visceral opposition to any new federal program, regardless of the concessions that had been made to earlier Republican prototypes. Second, Republicans adamantly opposed participating in any legislative effort whose success would legitimize President Obama, against whom party leaders and the conservative message machine had unleashed a brutal personalized attack, culminating later in 2010 with the iconic remark by Majority Leader McConnell that the single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. Now, I won't go through all the intricate parliamentary maneuvers that we had to employ to pass the bill, in fact, the bills, because it took 2 separate bills and an unprecedented level of trust between the leaderships of the House and the Senate to achieve this goal, nor do I have time to detail adequately the genuine acts of courage that enabled this legislation to proceed during moments of extreme peril. But let me give you a few. Conservative Democrat Congressman Mike Ross of Arkansas casting the key vote in the Commerce Committee markup in 2009 that enabled the bill to proceed, even though he could not support it on the floor, and voted no. Congressman Bart Stupak, a strong opponent of abortion, defying threats from right-to-life activists and standing up to vigorous opposition from Catholic bishops to help fashion a last-minute agreement on women's health, without which the bill surely would have collapsed. Freshman representatives like Tom Perriello and John Boccieri and Mary Jo Kilroy, who voted yes, knowing that they risked their careers in the House and did, in fact, pay the price at the polls in 2010. Before anybody makes a flip accusation that members of Congress can't get anything done, who believe that politicians care only about holding on to their office, that they will never stand up to a special interest, that they never put principle above politics, the history of the health care law needs to be reviewed. With the defeat of the House Democratic majority in 2010, the critics assumed key positions to launch further attacks on the law. They were aided in these efforts by the 4-year implementation schedule that was necessitated for planning and fiscal reasons, during which voters have been barraged with incessant criticisms of the ACA, while many of its key provisions have yet to go into effect. And yet, even with only the partial implementation of the law, the benefits of the new law are already incontrovertible. 1, the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, now estimates at $200 billion in Medicare and Medicaid savings in the year 2020, $1 trillion in savings overall by 2023, a significant improvement over pre-ACA estimates. 17 million children with pre-existing medical conditions can never be denied insurance coverage, a reform that will soon benefit 145 million Americans. 105 Americans, including 34 million Medicare seniors, 800,000 of them here in New Jersey, have already received free preventative care. The growth in overall health care spending has dropped for the fourth year in a row, the slowest rate of increase in 50 years. Medicare costs rose by less than 0.5% last year, and Medicaid costs dropped by nearly 2%, and hospital readmissions for Medicare beneficiaries just dropped for the first time in history. Premiums for employer-sponsored coverage in 2012 were 30% lower in 2010, the smallest increase in all but one of the last 13 years. $1.1 billion in rebates from health insurance companies have benefited nearly 13 million American families. 6.6 young Americans up to the age of 26 have been able to retain coverage through their parents' insurance, almost half of whom would have been uninsured. And over 360,000 small employers have received tax credits to offset the cost of offering health insurance to 2 million employees. And ultimately, 3 to 4 million small businesses will qualify for the subsidies. You can see the impact within your own families and within your own neighborhoods. Here in New Jersey, nearly 170,000 current Medicare beneficiaries have saved an average of $977 on their prescription medications, thanks to the ACA's provision closing the Part D donut hole, an ACA reform that has saved seniors nationally almost $6 billion. Large premium increases have been reduced by 80% for New Jersey residents. Over 2 million New Jersey residents with private insurance have gained free preventative services like pap smears and colonoscopies. Residents of New Jersey have also received nearly $8 million from the law's requirement that 80% of the premiums be spent on medical care. Importantly, analysts believe that these savings are coming from substantive change in the cost of health care delivery, not simply because of the recession or a reduction in demand. Now, can the ACA claim all the credit? No, of course not. But it is not credible to believe that these changes in savings and improved access would have occurred if health care reform had failed. This is the result we predicted. In fact, CBO had predicted savings of $1.5 trillion over the law's first 2 decades. Yes, the law is complicated. There are a lot of rules and forms to be filled out. Some men and younger and healthier people may see some premium increases in order to accommodate the law's non-discrimination language. And unquestionably, future Congresses are going to make changes in the law as problems or unforeseen complications emerge. As we know, a law does not need to be perfect to be enacted or to be defensible. But I would note this. Most of the law's complexities could have been avoided had we adopted a single-payer system, one that was opposed by those who now complain that the law is too complicated. This generous praise begs the obvious question. If this law is such a historic achievement, if it's beneficial to so many people, why the vitriol against it in the town hall meetings and on the Capitol grounds? Why the posters of the president with a Hitler mustache? And why crowds spitting on members of Congress as they went to work? How could people be so irate at the public option or at a mandate the conservatives themselves had formulated in the first place? Certainly the distrust of the ACA is symptomatic of a broad distrust of government, both by the left and by the right. Added to that is a growing incidence of what Frank Rich has called congenital historical amnesia that leaves tens of millions of Americans skeptical about what Congress should or is even authorized to do. Another explanation is the failure of the Obama administration to conduct a promised expansive public education effort to explain the law. Republican strategists took advantage of that message vacuum, promoting cartoonish mischaracterizations of Obamacare, which largely went unanswered in kind by the administration. A new Kaiser poll reports that 2/3 of those without insurance still lack basic information about how the law will impact them. Republicans have also used a majority role in the House to schedule periodic votes to repeal Obamacare, always promising to maintain the law's popular provisions, but repealing the mandate that provides the essential funding for them. This is what's known as the desserts first diet. But some Republican governors are now abandoning their initial opposition to one key provision, the Medicaid expansion, which would extend coverage to about 16 million Americans, half of those who gain coverage under the law. Their reconsideration is prompted by the federal government's agreement under the law to pay 100% of the additional costs for the first 3 years and at least 90% of the costs in future years. Arizona's Governor Jan Brewer, you may have remembered her shaking her finger in the president's face on the tarmac in Arizona last year. She realized that Arizona would receive 6 times as much money from the Medicaid expansion as the state will spend, and that Arizona can use the money to finance the Medicaid expansion that Arizona had instituted a decade before the ACA was even passed. She's been joined by other governors who initially had opposed expanded Medicaid assistance, including those in Nevada and Ohio and Michigan, New Mexico, Florida, North Dakota, and New Jersey. So what is the future of this complex law? Certainly, political resistance and perhaps even legal challenges remain, despite the Supreme Court's ruling last year. As the time comes for businesses and individuals to elect the type of coverage they prefer, there will be some confusion. The media predictably will find and focus upon the defiant patriot who will refuse to sign up for insurance or refuse to pay the fine. Last month, Congress failed to appropriate nearly $1 billion for implementation of the law, and the Senate recently voted in a largely symbolic vote on their budget to repeal the law's 2.3% tax on medical devices, a vote you can safely ascribe to special interest lobbying. And yet the history of such programs is that the complications smooth out over time. And as the policy becomes woven into the fabric of public policy, opposition diminishes. As we move towards full implementation, the number of benefits expand. Talk of repealing the ACA, I think, will increasingly go the way of fringe efforts to repeal Social Security. People will become invested in its protections and benefits, and as Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman has noted, it's difficult to deprive people of something they already possess, a lesson Congress knows very well. With many provisions still just about to go into effect, and with millions about to qualify for unprecedented affordable health insurance, I'm confident that in the years to come, the nation will come to embrace and benefit from the Affordable Care Act. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to respond to some questions. Thank you. I think we're going to take questions, and if you raise your hands, we can have the microphone brought over to you. Thank you. Go right ahead.
So you said that the Affordable Care Act extends coverage to millions of Americans, but at the same time, it'll save millions of dollars in future costs. Can you explain how that makes sense?
Sure. One of the major drivers of health care expenses is that people come into care late in the process, that they do not have access to preventative services, to diagnostic care, and that they end up relying upon emergency rooms as essentially their default medical care providers. That's the most expensive way to provide medical care. Because the Affordable Care Act allows for free preventative screenings and free childhood immunizations and preventative examinations, people will you will remove one of the inhibitions from coming in for early care. You'll get diagnostic work done early. You'll be able to have insurance and go to a private physician, as opposed to going to an emergency room after the illness has become more serious and requires greater amount of care.
Additional questions?
That's also why it's so critical that everybody be included, because if you give people the ability to opt out, the people who tend to opt out are the younger, healthier people. And that's all fine as long as nothing bad ever happens to them. But bad things happen, and then you're forced back into the most expensive types of health care coverage. Yes.
If I could ask you to please just tell us your name and how you're affiliated with Rutgers.
Hi, my name is Rajan, and I'm an undergraduate senior, and I'm one of the Eagleton associate. My question is, basically, we as Democrats understand the benefits of the Affordable Care Act, but the problem has been, just like TARP, just like Affordable Care Act, Democrats have been unable to get their message out across properly. And it has essentially, in terms of PR, we have failed. So what would you say went wrong in the PR message that the Democrats were trying to get across during the passage of this bill? And also, how can we improve our PR message that we critically need to. Because so far, all the acts passed by the Obama administration have been greatly rejected at times by the general public through the PR sentiments more so, rather than the facts of the subject and the substance of the bill.
Well, as I said, I don't disagree that Democrats lost the message war. And why is a little difficult to say. These were subjects of discussions that we had with people in the White House, with people in the administration, really even before the law was enacted, that it was going to require a very extensive explanation and message campaign, branding campaign. People are very aware in Washington of the need for effective message operations. One of the main reasons that we won the House in 2006 was that we understood and developed a very rigorous message campaign. We were assured at the time that the law was under development, that simultaneous with the policy development, there was a campaign being developed on the part of the administration to sell the law. To be quite honest about it, as I indicated in my remark, that effort really did not materialize. There are a lot of explanations for why, in terms of people moving on to other topics, people being overly focused on the passage of the law and allowing it to slip. I find those to be unconvincing because there was a very large messaging operation within the White House which was not responsible for developing the policy or for working with Congress to get it passed. We were also assured that there would be outside validators brought in, that there would be people from or other organizations or organizations created by the White House or by the Democratic National Committee to advocate. It basically didn't happen. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time watching television, to be quite honest about it, but if there is a message campaign, I've never seen it. And I certainly haven't seen what we really needed to have, and that is, you know, we have a lot of members of Congress who will go out and talk about this in their town hall meetings. But once you give up the big megaphone and you don't have the president out there hammering away on it, then you've really lost your message advantage, and I think that's what happened. We have seen a fairly steady increase in public support. It is growing. I think it grows in part as people encounter benefits, and I think that's why I'm confident that it's going to improve, because as we move into October of this year and the next year and people start getting the ability to buy into an exchange and securing coverage, people will begin to realize that was there. But you know, for a long time, because we had to have this 4-year ramp up, people were not even aware. All they knew was what they heard, and all they heard was negative. Yes.
My name is Lapurva Malampati. I'm from the local health department, but I'm also a student here at Rutgers. I have 2 questions. How will the penalties be enforced? And why is the donut hole projected to close in 2020? And is that expected to be expedited?
The question was about the donut hole. We've provided funds to allow the payment that would, the amount of money. The donut hole is created, for those of you who are not yet living with it, was created as part of the Part D Medicare expansion under President Bush. It basically increased support for prescription payments up to a certain level, and then there was a period where your benefits don't go up, and then when you get to what would be a very high level, benefits kick in again. That middle area that is not covered is called the donut hole. And the reason it wasn't covered is very simple, because it costs too much money to cover it. And so in healthcare policy, when you make trade-offs like that, it's just called cost shifting. You just make a decision somebody else will pay. And in this case, the decision was made that overall taxpayers would pay for the program, because the program was completely unpaid for. It's one of the major contributors to the growth of the debt, along with the Bush tax cuts and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. None of that was paid for, and that's helped run up the deficit. And what we do in the ACA is we bring down those, we shut that down so that eventually the benefits do not hit a point where the beneficiary has to pay the cost. So that's the way in which we eliminate the donut hole. I'm sorry, what was the first part again? Through the tax system. Yes.
And the first part of that was how would the penalties be
I'm sorry,
enforced?
how would tax, yeah, so in your tax form, you will have to indicate what your coverage is, just like you do when you're applying for a driver's license. You have to show where your insurance company is, and if you don't have something, then there's a penalty that would be paid. Yes?
I'm Steve Levine. I'm a retired engineer. I have a non-healthcare but political question for you. If the first Democratic black president of the United States had been, for example, Colin Powell rather than Barack Obama, how would things have been different?
You're an engineer because you know how to design a question. I can tell that. I think that General Powell would have brought one series of skills to the presidency. President Obama brought another series of skills to the presidency. If you're trying to get at the question, is there some underlying aspect of opposition which is attributable to race? I'll leave that to other people to decide. Yeah. I'd like to call on some students if I can. Just yeah. Professors come second.
So, my name is Valen Zelter. Valen Zelter. I'm a political science major here at Rutgers University. And in 2014, when the individual mandate comes into law, we know there's always going to be that one individual who refuses to follow it. How would that affect the law if the courts found that it is actually unconstitutional to force people to purchase health care?
That issue has really been litigated and decided by the Supreme Court. Yeah.
Okay.
The Congress under the 13th Amendment has the ability to tax, and courts found, notwithstanding the fact the government wasn't prepared to argue it, the courts found anyway it's a tax and it's a legitimate exercise of authority.
Hi, my name is Chris Marchetti. I'm a finance and poli-sci major. I remember when Obamacare began, there was a lot of complaints that the president should have focused on jobs instead or not have pursued it so early. And the opposition to it was bordered from reluctance to talk about death panels. So in the immediate aftermath and during the passage of the bill, what was the relationship that Obama had with Congress? And now that those tempers may have abated, what is the current state of the executive's relationship with the legislative branch?
Well, yeah, it's true, as I indicated in my remarks, that there was definitely a tension between not only the economy and healthcare, but there was also a lot of pressure for energy legislation. There were a number of other things. This is one of the favorite criticisms that's made for both the administration and for the Congress focusing on healthcare, that we really should have been focusing on the economy. But let's go back and remember what was actually happening there, okay? The first major bill that we passed after the Lilly Ledbetter law, which was the first bill the president signed into law to expand women's rights in the workplace for equal pay, was the stimulus bill. The stimulus bill was almost $900 billion of economic stimulus and jobs. Okay? It barely passed. It had virtually no Republican support. I'm not sure it did have any Republican support, in fact. So to now come back a few months later and say, well, you shouldn't have done health care. You should have done more jobs legislation. Well, we barely passed the first jobs legislation. Why would anyone believe we would have had the votes to pass another 6 or 8? Now, it should have been a larger bill. It probably should have been $1.2 or $1.3 trillion, but we didn't have the votes to do that, so we passed the bill we could pass. It probably should have been more jobs and less tax cuts, but that's the way the bill was negotiated, and that's the way it is. So in an ideal world, yes, I think it would have been a smart idea to spend more time on additional jobs legislation. But there was no chance whatsoever of more jobs legislation passing. None. Zero. So it would have been, you would have squandered the effort to do health care. You know, the president came into office, and I had a chance to talk with him, you know, after he was elected, but before he was in office, and we talked very frankly about his desire to develop a bipartisan working relationship with Republicans. He had that kind of relationship in the Illinois legislature when he was in the Senate there, and I think he felt that however much of a challenge that might be, that he was prepared to try to do that. He just has not found that willingness, and you know, really that's another lecture, to be honest about it, as to why that resistance has existed. But it was really almost from the get-go. I mean, I'll give you an example. When we were developing the stimulus bill, we were trying to fashion a bipartisan bill. They in the Senate they actually did end up with, I think, 3 or 4 Republican senators voting for it. And the president said at one point, "Look, I'll come up to talk to the Republican conference, their caucus, and tell me what you want, and you know, we'll try and put it in the bill and see if we can." I can't promise, but we'll try. Between the time he left the White House and literally the time he arrived at the Cannon Building, the Republican leadership had come out of their meeting and announced that no matter what the president said, they would not agree to the bill. So, I mean, that doesn't foster really good working relationships, when, you know, in a political setting. And yet you've seen repeatedly on the fiscal cliff and the debt ceiling and the continuing resolutions last year. I'm talking to the students here, they know what I'm talking about. You know, you've seen the president bring Speaker Boehner down. You've seen him come up and meet with, now he's doing dinners, you know, with members. So I think there's an attempt there. There was a bit of a discussion going on, I think, at the end of last year that began with Bob Woodward's book on the July 2011 fiscal cliff debt ceiling negotiations, that suggested that if the president had only had Republicans down to the White House more for dinner, that he would have found a more receptive bipartisan spirit. I got to tell you, that's just not, that may be how you sell books, but that doesn't have anything to do with political reality. The president went to their conferences, other cabinet members went to their conferences. There were numerous social opportunities, Christmas parties, congressional picnics. And the problem wasn't that they weren't buddies enough. There was just something else going on there. And as I say, I'm happy to talk about that, but it's sort of an extensive, different topic.
I think we have another student question in the back here.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Stephen Medinsky. I'm an Eagleton undergraduate associate. My question is, now that we've had a few years since the health care bill has passed, is there anything that you personally, I guess, would have liked to see maybe added, changed, subtracted, maybe something you didn't think of at the time, now that, you know, but now that we've seen how it's been implemented partially? And also, can you see any changes being made to it maybe in the next 5-10 years as it starts to take effect? Do you see any other reforms maybe being added on?
On the second part, I can't really say. I think that when we get into the implementation phase, the full implementation phase, you'll probably see some things that don't work quite as they were anticipated. It's just very hard. Again, to predict that. You know, the nature of this system is that you're grafting onto an existing system. You know, one of the favorite arguments I always get into with my liberal friends is they say, well, you know, this is the way it's done in Denmark. Why can't we do it that way? You know, or this is the way it's done in Sweden. Why can't we do it that way? Well, this is a little more complicated here, okay? We've got 50 states. We've got thousands of private insurance companies. We've got healthcare industry. The notion that you were going to come in and just completely create a brand new program, that was a pipe dream that never really worked. So you had to sort of weave in between the existing aspects of healthcare, and it's not going to be perfect. As I say, there are going to be places where adjustments are going to be made. I don't know where those are going to be. In terms of the changes I would make, as I indicated, in a perfect world, I think we should have simply expanded Medicare for everybody. and that would have been it. But you're not going to do that because the insurance industry, among others, have other plans. But I guess the one practical thing I would have liked to have done would have been to speed up implementation. And for most of the period of time that we were doing it, it was supposed to go fully into effect in 2013. At the very end, because the negotiations had dragged so long into 2010 instead of 2009, we had basically lost an entire year. So for fiscal reasons, we had to punt it to 2014. The net effect is that it takes longer for people to realize what their benefits are. So I think that's the one piece of it. I mean, there are lots of little other bits that I would have liked. I mean, personally, I would have liked to have seen a much simpler approach on women's health. I don't see why we have to have people filling out different forms and different programs and all that stuff, but that's just the way you had to put it together. Yeah. You pick, Randy.
Hi, Buddy Tell, and I'm just a friend of Rutgers. I'm a little confused about how the exchanges are going to work and be made affordable. In this area, a health insurance policy could be anywhere from $6,000 to $12,000 for a modest policy.
Mm-hmm.
For those people who are not insured by their companies, how are they going to afford that kind of policy? Because I don't expect the government's going to be passing out that kind of money to subsidize it.
Well, there are in fact subsidies that are built in if you're an individual, and you could end up there in an exchange because you're an individual, self-employed, or you could end up there because your employer opts not. A smaller employer can opt out of the program and pay a fee instead. And there is then a schedule of subsidies that go in. And that's one of the reasons the cost is expensive, and that is one of the reasons why certain premiums may go up, so that you can cover the costs for others. The exchanges are supposed to be set up on an individual basis by the states. There actually are large numbers of states, probably in excess of 30 now, that say they are not going to set up an exchange. That under those circumstances, the federal government has to set up an exchange within the state. I think states are doing that largely because they don't want to spend their own money. They'd rather pass the bill on to the federal government. And that may raise federal expenses. It may delay some implementation. There were some discussions, I guess, at HHS or Department of Health and Human Services earlier this month, even, that there may be some slippage on dates. But the short answer to your question is that it's going to be done through subsidization.
My name is Veronica McAvoy. I've been a registered nurse for 27 years now. I don't know if there's any discussion about patient compliance, because hospitals now are not going to get reimbursed if a patient's been readmitted with the same diagnosis within a month, and that it really affects our bottom line. Has anything been said about that? Or the patients who are non-compliant, their co-pays are going to go up higher? Or their insurance premium?
When you say the patient is not
Let's say a patient gets diagnosed with congestive heart failure, and through Medicare, if they get readmitted with the same diagnosis within a month, the hospital will not get reimbursed for it. And this affects the hospital's bottom line. As well as I see in our area, a number of doctors have left their practice and now being hired by hospitals as hospitalists. How is that going to affect the community and all these new patients coming on board with this insurance? And really, patient compliance is really the big question.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I don't know that aspect of the. I don't know the extent to which that's driven by the law or that's driven by patient behavior. I honestly don't know. I mean, I'll try to find out, but I can't answer the question. I don't know. I mean, I think the one thing I think that you have to keep in mind, though, because there obviously are many problems that could be identified as attributable to the healthcare law. We can't pretend that everything was good in healthcare before the healthcare law was put in place in terms of access to care, in terms of affordability of care, in terms of people being dropped from coverage, in terms of people affording coverage. We didn't do the law because we didn't have anything else to do one day, you know. And there was a very well documented crisis, not the least of which was this in rapidly escalating costs associated with the program. So there was a necessity, there was an urgency behind the way the key features of this bill were put together to address what were developing and serious existing problems in delivery and cost controls in healthcare. Yeah.
My name is Sophia Wallace, and I'm a political science professor at Rutgers. So my question for you is not about healthcare, but is instead, as my students know, my favorite topic, immigration reform. So given party polarization, both within each chamber, but also even within parties at this point, what do you think is realistically going to happen with immigration reform? What's plausible? What do you think is, you've talked a lot about how in healthcare certain provisions were killer provisions. What are those similar provisions that you see in potential immigration reform, given that right now, at least what the Senate's proposing and how House people are thinking about it, are entirely different and different within parties as well?
Well, I'm not an immigration law expert. I've been around the immigration debate numerous times during the course of my career. I think when you push all the extraneous issues away, really the immigration debate comes down to what are you going to do with the people who are here? I mean, if that issue didn't exist, we could solve that debate in about 20 minutes. I think you went through a period of time in the last couple of years where, because of the campaign season and just, I don't know, something going on in the atmosphere, people were talking about sending 11 million people back. Everybody knows you're not going to send 11 million people back. It's not going to happen. So the real issue is what are you going to do about the current undocumented people? There are some related issues such as birthright citizenship. There are some other issues that are related to children with undocumented parents. If you can solve that problem, you're going to solve the immigration debate, because there's general agreement about enhancing border security. There's general agreement about how you document jobs in fact, there was just this agreement that was entered into last week between the business community and organized labor, which is a major development because it does allow hundreds of thousands of people to come in for lower income, lower skilled jobs, which for labor is a big concession. And for some conservatives, a big concession, because the anticipation is some of those people are going to stay and then be affected by whatever path to citizenship or path to permanency. I really find myself always a perennial pessimist around the immigration debate. I've seen this debate too many times, and it always seems to founder around the same basic issues. What I would say is that there is reason to be a little more optimistic now because the demographics politically are changing so dramatically. And if you look at states, particularly where Hispanics, although it's not purely a Hispanic issue, but it's more a Hispanic issue, frankly, than anything else, where those numbers are being driven up by either immigration or by births, even though Hispanic birth rate is actually dropping. There are a lot of states there that I hate to be political, but then again, you wouldn't be here if you weren't political. If the Republican Party is perceived by the Hispanic electorate as being hostile, then they're never going to win the White House again, because they will lose Florida as sure as we're all sitting here. And once they lose Florida, the show is over. But it's even more serious than that, because they'll probably lose Texas in the 2020 reapportionment, assuming Texas at some point will reapportion consistent with the U.S. Constitution. And if that's the case, then you basically talked yourself out of national political domination. You may control congressional districts, but you're not going to control states. You're not going to control the Senate, and you're not going to control the White House. So I think that what makes me encourage is that politicians do have a way of focusing when it comes down to political survival. And political survival in this case, I think, is dictating that particularly Republican. It's more of a Republican problem than there are some Democratic issues. It's more, if you look in the constellation of the two caucuses, it's predominantly a Republican problem. That they're going to have to be more. They're going to be more realistic. But the caveat there is that the core Republican primary electorate sees this issue a little differently than, you know, Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush might see it. And so, you know, you saw Jeb Bush sort of out there talking about, well, I think we probably could have some sort of a path to citizenship, and that lasted, you know, about 90 seconds before he decided he had been misquoted or taken out of context. So I think it's evolving. I don't know that it can evolve in the context of this election season or not. You certainly have not seen anything on the part of the House that would suggest that. The Judiciary Committee in the House hasn't even held hearings and has not indicated any interest. It will start in the Senate. We've always had that agreement that immigration reform will start there. We'll see if they can do something. Maybe the Gang of Eight will actually be able to produce something. Gangs of Eight don't tend to produce as much as they think they're going to produce, but maybe it will this time. If they pass something, then I think there'll be some fairly heavy pressure on the House.
We have just
I wanted to call
3
on
minutes
somebody who
left.
hasn't asked a question already, if you don't mind. But
Yep. Right over here,
yeah,
is that okay?
sure. You got the mic.
Hi, my name is Ellen Brown. I'm decades ago Rutgers graduate, and I'm a recent retiree as a social worker case manager from a hospital healthcare system. But my question is related to the Affordable Care Act. You had mentioned something in passing that it was essentially modeled on Romney Care, but certain features were less onerous in the national bill. And I've been recently reading that many companies that part of what was passed was that if they opt not to insure their employees, they will be fined $2,000 per employee. And many of them are now deciding that it's cheaper to pay the penalty than to provide the insurance. Is that something that was anticipated or discussed, or is this something that's an unintended consequence? Because it could have major issues for certainly the students when they go to look for jobs.
Yeah. To be honest with you, I don't know whether that $2,000 fee, that strikes me as a little high. What I said in my talk was that the penalties in Massachusetts are higher, and they do have a very high rate of compliance. I think it's close to 98% compliance. I think that the $2,000 is high in terms of what they have to pay, what the private employers have to pay. But in any event, yes, that was a concern. They're clearly, you know, business people are going to run the bottom line here. And there are some variables that come into play in terms of attracting, you know, employees as to whether or not you're offering health care or not. I understand that in this market, that may not be the foremost subject on people's minds, and it may be less so if you know that you can go to the exchange and get a subsidized program from the government. We were aware of that at the time, and it is something that could conceivably drive up public costs. That's it. Okay. Okay, thank you.
I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank John Lawrence, and I wish you all good health.